Once upon a time, when I was a student at Fordham University, I wrote a letter to Ludwig von Mises asking him to come to Fordham to speak. And so I, tried to be as respectful as possible and also remind him that we were just poor students, so we couldn't give him any big honorarium or anything. Couldn't give him any honorarium. So I sent the letter off. And a week or so later, I got a phone call. And on the other side of the phone, there was a man who said, "Mises here." So I stood up straight. And, anyway, we started talking about what he would speak about. And I tried to explain to him that the organization sponsoring the lecture were the Fordham Libertarian Alliance and the Philosophy Club and the Economics Club. And I thought a good topic that would get interest in all of the groups, and which he had written about, was epistemological problems of economics. So he said, "No, I don't want to talk about that." He said, I said, "What do you want to talk about?" He said, "I want to talk about inflation, or as he said, money problems." So I tried to explain how I didn't just say yes, explain no, you see. So anyway, then we met him and this and that, and finally he agreed to the following. He said, okay, we compromise. He would speak on epistemological problems of money. So we thought that was a good, I had no idea what that would be. I thought that was a good solution. So he came and he spoke about inflation. And I've been asked to speak about time and economics, and so I'm going to speak about something else. Seriously, I don't think I can speak on time, about time, without talking about equilibrium and without talking about learning. So I'm going to try to mix all three together. And it's also the case that you've been going through a lot today. Somebody told me this is your 7th session. And so I'm going to try to keep this as pleasant as possible. It's a statement by St. Augustine of Hippo, which I like. Does anybody know if St. Augustine had a first name? I mean, like Charlie or something? I'm thinking of changing my first name from Mario to Saint. But anyway, St. Augustine of Hippo says, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to one who asks, I do not know." And in some respect, the less you think about time, the more you know about it. And the more you think about time, the less you know about it. If you really want to get into this stuff, I can recommend an article by myself that's on my B-Press site, which I published in, I guess, in 2000, Real Time and Relative Indeterminacy in Economic Theory. And you'll get the full version of this. But for now, I want to start out by talking about Hayek's project in the late 30s and early 40s. And that was to marry, as he put it, equilibrium and time. Now, the great Hayekian contribution, and not only Hayek's contribution, but contribution of people like Eric Lindahl and other economists, was to center economic analysis on the idea of the plan and to talk about equilibrium in terms of plans. Now, once you talk about plans, you're not talking about a single instant in time. you're talking about actions which are over a period of time. And what unites them is that in some way they're integrated, right? They're self-consistent. And so Hayek, wanting to look at equilibrium in a more dynamic way, chose to look at equilibrium in terms of plans rather than of specific actions. Now, there are a number of elements to this plan analysis, and I want to just briefly indicate the four cells in this sort of analytical matrix. The first idea is to talk about the plan from the individual's point of view. That is to say, the individual's plan and whether it is in equilibrium or not. Now, the idea of the equilibrium of the individual is usually taken for granted in economics, and in some ways it's coextensive with the idea of rationality. And the idea of individual equilibrium, Hayek suggested, was more or less a truism or a tautology. At least that's how he looked at it. The idea that the various actions that an individual schedules over a period of time are integrated in some way. They are self-consistent or part of a plan. So we can have plans at the individual level, right? We can think about the relationship of actions at the individual level, and we can think about whether they're integrated or not. Now, at the individual level, there is both a sort of an ex ante perspective and an ex post perspective. All right, an individual may have plans of various actions which are based on certain assumptions about the world. Right? It will rain tomorrow, or it will not rain tomorrow. Right? There will be a shortage or a greater scarcity of a particular commodity in a year, or lesser scarcity in a year. Something to do with the external world, whether it be external to human action itself, like it's going to rain, or external to his own action, like there's a growing scarcity of a particular commodity. These assumptions may prove to be true or not true. So the individual could have a self-consistent plan ex ante, but not necessarily ex post, right? Because ex post, it may turn out that some of the assumptions he's making about the real world do not come to pass, and therefore he regrets having made those particular plans. So from an individual perspective, ex ante and ex post, we can talk about equilibrium. But it's in terms of the relationship of actions within a whole complex of actions, the plan. So in a way, we have brought in time immediately, right? The way we brought in time is because we have scheduled actions over a period, right? It's not just a particular action at a particular point in time. And we've also brought in time because we've allowed there to be some difference between ex ante and ex post, right? The things that the assumptions the plan is making may not prove to be true. So it may not prove to come about. Now, as I said, Hayek thought the idea of ex ante individual equilibrium was more or less a tautology. One of the things I've noticed in recent years is that really has been challenged. The idea that we should look at that as a tautology in a lot of the behavioral economics. which tries to show that various assumptions about the consistency of individual actions do not hold. All right, that individuals do not obey various consistency requirements in terms of the actions that they plan to engage in over a period of time. So we have things like individuals planning to stop smoking, and then when the day comes that they're supposed to stop, they change their minds, things of that sort. I think a lot of that can be interpreted as suggesting that individuals do not automatically have consistent plans, self-consistent plans. But obviously that is something that has come about in more recent years. I think even today most economists would think of the individual equilibrium as being pretty much taken for granted, coextensive with rationality or perhaps a tautology. All right, the second column has to do with the social aspects of equilibrium, and that is the interpersonal compatibility of plans. If I think it's going to rain tomorrow and I plan to make umbrellas, do you also plan to buy umbrellas? Is there a compatibility of the plans of various agents within the system ex ante? Right? We're all thinking about, let's say, tomorrow's weather. I'm thinking about making umbrellas in anticipation of the rain. You're thinking about buying umbrellas in anticipation of the rain. That could be an equilibrium, right? If the plans are compatible ex ante. But of course, ex post, right, it may turn out that the anticipation of rain proves not to be correct, or that it proves to be correct. If it proves to be correct, then the ex ante equilibrium is transformed into ex post. If it's not, then we have ex post to disequilibrium. Okay, now this is, I think, a good diagram expressing Hayek in sort of 1937 in his article, Economics and Knowledge. But the story goes beyond that for obvious reasons. First of all, whether time is in this model, but it's in this model or in this scheme in a very, very static way, right? You allow for there to be disappointment, but once there's disappointment, plans are incompatible, and as far as this scheme is concerned, that's that, right? So the real dynamic aspect of it has to rest on what happens when there's some sort of disequilibrium in the system. Now we have to distinguish a few things at this point. One is to distinguish between the mutual compatibility of plans and more generally coordination. In the 1937 Hayek, he says that complete compatibility of plans need not be a Pareto optimal situation. And one way of interpreting this, which I find useful, is the following. If you think about Kerzner's idea of the entrepreneur as an arbitrageur, think of there being two parts of a single market in which whatever is being traded at different prices. Now, the reason there are these two parts of a single market, the single market being defined, I guess, in terms of the zero transportation costs, is because the parties in this part are unaware of the parties in that part and vice versa. Okay? Now, clearly, in each one of these situations, parts of the market, you could have complete compatibility of plans in the sense that nobody's bumping their head against each other in each part of the market, right? Traders are trading at this equilibrium price here and at that equilibrium price here, and they are not experiencing any frustration or any incompatibilities. Yet it's not a Pareto optimal situation because obviously there's room for arbitrage between the two parts of the market. So complete coordination, I'm using now a different word, complete coordination of plans would be a case in which not only is there this mutual compatibility of plans, but also all arbitrage opportunities are eliminated, and therefore we have what Kerzner would call plan coordination, complete plan coordination. Now the reason that it's important to think about the difference between compatibility of plans and coordination of plans has to do with learning. In the 1937 article, Hayek placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that if there were incompatibility of plans, if the parties were bumping their heads against each other, in effect, right, there would be an immediate incentive to do something different. Okay? The parties would know that something had to change because they would be very directly frustrated in their ability to implement their plans. However, in the case of the lack of complete coordination, the learning is not as obvious, right? Because nobody's bumping their heads here, nobody's bumping their heads there. So this is a case of, like, ignorance is bliss, right? You don't know what's happening, and if you stay in that position, everything can go on as before. In the case of the mutual incompatibility of plans, it's hard to argue that you can sort of avoid recognizing what's going on. So, in the case of the mutual incompatibility, Hayek says, in effect, that the parties are bound to find out what it takes to produce compatibility. Now, it's interesting. He says that we have to take it into two parts. One, it's easy to understand how they're bound to find out that there's incompatibility. How they're bound to find out what, in effect, the equilibrium is a separate question. I don't think it's quite as obvious that they're bound to find that out. But if we're dealing with parties who are in sort of direct contact with each other, and with parties that are trying to engage in mutually beneficial trade, the chances that they will be able to find the equilibrium are probably greater than in many other kinds of situations. So I interpret his bound to find out as more a statement of the relative ease of finding equilibrium in that particular kind of situation. Now, okay, so now what in fact we have is a number of criteria for a sort of full Hayekian equilibrium. The first is that there's individual consistency of plans, both ex ante and ex post. Second, there is mutual compatibility of plans across individuals, both ex ante and ex post. And thirdly, there is exhaustion of profit or arbitrage opportunities within the system. Now, what's the status of this equilibrium concept? Well, it's clear that no Austrian and really most other economists at the time would not have looked at these equilibria, either any of the individual ones or the totality, as a description of reality. It's simply an analytical tool. And so, as an analytical tool, one has to just think about what are its purposes. And what Hayek himself said that he thought that some assumption about a tendency toward equilibrium is necessary for economics. That you can't really have an economics without the assumption of a tendency toward equilibrium. So this idea of equilibrium justifies itself by a notion that there is a tendency toward it, and that's why it's useful as an analytical tool. Now, the word tendency is a messy word, and we have to admit that there's a lot of vagueness associated with the word tendency. And some people interpret tendency as meaning something like we do in fact get arbitrarily close to this position in the real world. And there is some evidence in Hayek in the Pure Theory of Capital, in one of the footnotes, that Hayek is thinking in those terms as well. But I think that a fairer evaluation of what Hayek believed, a more accurate evaluation of what Hayek believed, is not in that footnote, but rather in the idea that we can understand something about processes or disequilibrium states, disequilibrium processes, by virtue of thinking about them as adjustments that tend, that is to say, in the absence of disturbing factors, tend to reestablish an equilibrium. In the absence of disturbing factors, which there always are, and so therefore you don't necessarily get close to the equilibrium. I think that's more or less what Hayek thought. Now, in these earlier articles. Now, one of the, moving beyond Hayek, one of the differences, I think, in ways that Austrians have looked at this kind of the usefulness of the equilibrium construct is that some, including Hayek at this period, want to throw everything that disturbs equilibrium into a category called exogenous factors. Shocks in demand, shocks in knowledge, they're all in a sense outside the system. They disturb the system from the outside. Then what happens is, once the system has been disturbed from the outside, there are certain factors within the system that constitute this tendency to reestablish the equilibrium. So the adjusting change is always an equilibrating factor, but it's that way by construction. It's that way because you take everything that doesn't tend to reestablish the equilibrium or an equilibrium, and you throw it out into exogenous factors. So you have endogenous factors, adjusting change, which are so defined as to exclude anything that's disruptive. So to say that there is a tendency toward equilibrium is, in a way, a kind of analytically correct statement, but should not be interpreted as settling the matter from an empirical point of view. It's just a way of organizing the various forces that are at play. I remember Professor Lachman used to say, well, if there are equilibrating forces, there are also disequilibrating forces. And I think he used to say that in part because he didn't appreciate the fact that the argument about tendency toward equilibrium is kind of a definitional thing. It's setting up the analysis in such a way that the forces that move toward equilibrium are part of this tendency and the others are kept out. But he was right to raise the question, well, what does this say about the real world, and what does it say about when equilibria are disturbed, whether in fact new equilibria are quickly reestablished or not? So we have to think about the process of adjustment and think about it not simply from the analytical point of view, but from a more realistic point of view. And this is where the two types of time that I've talked about come in, or the two conceptions of time. Real, and I guess I should have called the other one unreal, Newtonian, or static. All right. We'll call this dynamic. The key difference between real time and Newtonian conception of time, or dynamic and static, is whether the passage of time necessarily involves changes in knowledge. In a static conception, the passage of time does not necessarily involve any change in knowledge. So, you can have time changing and nothing much happening. As in the case of a sort of a planned equilibrium, when you're in equilibrium and you have a plan, right, time will elapse, but if you're in both ex ante and ex post equilibrium, as time elapses, nothing new happens. Right? So you don't change any of your activity, you just move along in that way. On the other hand, if you think of time as inextricably linked up with changes in knowledge, then first of all, your plan is likely to be a much more flexible plan than otherwise is the case. Why? Because you know not what will happen, but you know that something unexpected might well happen. And so your plan would tend to be a lot more flexible, a lot more general, allowing for changes at a moment's notice, in effect, where appropriate. So the character of planning under a real conception of time as opposed to a Newtonian conception of time would be very different. And in fact, plans would tend to be much more precise under the Newtonian and much vaguer under the real conception. And that leads, of course, to a transformation of the concept of equilibrium, right? Because if you have agents operating in real time, to say that their plans mesh is not to say that they mesh in any precise way, but that they may mesh but allowing for a lot of imprecision. In other words, in some sense, there will be, in some sense, don't take this word too literally, an optimal amount of discoordination, right? Because you can't make plans that are very precise when you realize the world can present you with unexpected things at any point. All right. Now let's let me move ahead a little bit to Hayek in late 60s and 70s. And you may be familiar with an article which he wrote called Competition as a Discovery Procedure. Competition as discovery. Now, if we, and since competition is sort of the kind of essence of the market process, you could think of this as really saying the market as discovery, or the market process as discovery. Now, first of all, I want you to see why I'm bringing this up. I'm bringing this up because if we have a situation, a plan incompatibility, right, then agents have to discover what will render their plans, the plans of the actors with whom they are more directly concerned, what will render those plans more compatible. Right? It's not true, as Hayek said in 1937 or whatever, that they're bound to find out what will make their plans compatible. They're not bound to find out. And furthermore, in the case of the more extended notion, namely the elimination of arbitrage opportunities, there's no being bound to find out that there are opportunities somewhere in the system that have not been exploited and that could be exploited. So this whole idea of sort of a deterministic or definite learning is outside the picture, I think. So we have to think about then the market as a discovery process and what that entails. In that article, Hayek makes much of the idea that competition is desirable precisely because it produces results that are unpredictable. In other words, he wanted to contrast his view of competition with the standard view. The standard view has it that there are certain characteristics or criteria or conditions which, if fulfilled, means we're in competition, perfect competition. And so what competition tends to mean in that kind of situation is that certain equilibrium and optimality conditions are fulfilled. Which means then that competition is like I guess a computer or something. It's like a computer which not only churns out the right results, things like price equal to average cost, things of that sort, not only churns out those results, but also somehow enforces them in the world. Right? So it's all about computation. On the other hand, if you take a Hayekian or Schumpeterian view of competition, you realize that competition, a lot of what we call competition in sort of everyday language, It's really about discovering new ways of doing things. So competition, the market, tends to produce surprises. Right? Now go back to the situation of plan incompatibility or lack of complete coordination of plans. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm looking around for arbitrage opportunities. Why am I doing that? Because that's what I do. So I'm looking for these opportunities. Now, if they were known to everybody, there wouldn't be any opportunities, right? So they're obviously not known to everybody. Most people don't know of them. So if I take advantage of them, if I act on the basis of these opportunities, I'm engaging in actions which other people, many other people, could not have predicted I would engage in. Right? Because they don't know of the existence of these opportunities. So how could they predict that I would engage in them? So my attempt to discover opportunities as this arbitrageur creates a situation in which I engage in actions which are unpredictable to other actors. Now, clearly, if we focus just on a particular market, right? Go back to that thing where there were two parts of the market. Okay, something exchanging at $5 here, $10 here. And a entrepreneur discovers the two markets and therefore discovers the arbitrage opportunities, the arbitrage opportunity. You could tell a little story about how the prices harmonize, they become the same, the tendency toward a uniform price. You can tell that kind of simple story, and for that purpose it may be perfectly appropriate and perfectly right. On the other hand, my activity in buying in this market and selling in this market is not something which the agents of the system could predict, right? And if you multiply this throughout many parts of the market, of the different markets, what you see is entrepreneurs engaging fairly regularly in activity that cannot be precisely predicted by other agents in the market. So, the upshot of that fact led, I believe, Hayek to a state of affairs, a sort of mental state of affairs, in which he began more and more to doubt the usefulness of the traditional equilibrium concept. He says, I believe in this article, but he may be somewhere else, but around that time, that a better concept than equilibrium is the concept of order. And he says, not very helpfully, I have to say, that order is more like, think of a stream and the water kind of paying some attention to the banks of it, but, coming outside. And so the idea is that order, or some improved equilibrium concept, tends to be something which is much less precise than our normal idea of equilibrium. It has more to do with there being certain parameters and certain factors which we can rely on, but we have to understand there's going to be a lot of unpredictability going on within all of that. Now, very much like what you would think of if you said, let's think about time and changes in knowledge going together, right? If time is static, the static conception of time, right, then everything would stay within the bank. So everything would move precisely as predicted. Nothing new would ever happen. That's the idea of static conception of time. In real time, where knowledge is changing, right, people are doing all sorts of things which make the world much less precise because it's hard to predict what people are going to do. Can't predict what people are going to do because you can't predict what knowledge they're going to acquire. So it's not only that knowledge is changing, right, but knowledge is changing in an unpredictable way. Popper has this statement, future knowledge cannot be acquired before its time. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be future knowledge. So the idea of competition as discovery, right, finding out truly new things that you couldn't have known before because of the process of competition, creates a world in which, right, a certain amount of unpredictability is built in. Now, what is it built into? I said earlier that there was this conception or this analytical device which says, put all the things that disturb the equilibrium, the fairly precise equilibrium, into the category of exogenous factors. Changes in knowledge. It disrupts the system. It's exogenous. It's not part of the adjusting changes. But now what we see is that the very essence of adjustment, which is entrepreneurship, right, the discovery of opportunities, both in the context of this arbitrage example, but also in a smaller way, but still significant way, in the context of parties bumping their heads against each other, right, where there's a direct incompatibility between buyers and sellers about what price to charge. Even there, the process of finding out what the equilibrium price is a process of entrepreneurial discovery. But entrepreneurial discovery is essentially, and I mean this in kind of a technical sense, is essentially an unpredictable phenomenon. So, the very factor that's responsible for adjusting to disequilibria also, to a certain extent, produces unpredictability and therefore, in a sense, discoordination. The two things are mutually connected, I mean, in a real world sense. Now, I'm not denying that analytically you can separate those two things out. You could pretend that the entrepreneur learns these things and somehow nobody else in the system is taken aback or surprised and therefore has his plans undone. The entrepreneur discovers a new way to produce something more cheaply, right? I've already bought umpteen units of the product that now is not going to be used anymore because he found a way to do without it, right? So now my plans are frustrated. All part of the adjustment process. All right. So, where are we? Well, one place we are is back to Hayek's notion of order and to a statement which he makes in I believe in law, legislation, and liberty in a slightly different context, but I think it's still highly relevant. Actually, it's in competition as discovery procedure, but it's also in law, legislation, and liberty. He tended to say the same things in a lot of places, you know. I mean, what he said was so good that he could say it as much or as often as he wants. It doesn't bother me. Have any of you heard these interviews with Hayek that are now up on the web? There's like 18 hours or interviews, yeah. There are various interviewers, Axel Leonard, Armin Alshin, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say that he says the same thing in all of them practically, but the interviewers are different, right? And some of those interviewers, I'm not going to mention names, but they're famous people, some of them. They don't hold a candle to them. I mean, they're like buffoons, I think, in some cases. Asking him, they don't really understand what he's talking. He says the same thing, basically, in the interviews, but he says it really well. And so it's a pleasure. You should take a look at some of those interviews. So other people, when they repeat themselves, it's intolerable. When Hayek repeats himself, it's okay. All right. Now back to, this is the quotation from Competition to Discovery Procedure. A high degree of correspondence of expectations is brought about by the systematic disappointment of some kinds of expectations. Now, if that had been only in law, legislation, and liberty, I would say that refers to the law, you know, say the contract law providing a structure of predictable rules, and within that structure of predictable rules, you have changes in market prices and all sorts of market changes, so that you can have a market process because you have certain things you can rely on, certain focal points, like the contract law. But within that, there could be all sorts of disappointment of expectations. That's how I would interpret. But in this case, in this article, how I interpret that is something like this. Hayek is saying, look, competition produces things which are novel, unpredictable. Some expectations are disappointed, right? Because other market participants don't realize that, you know, the horse and the horseshoe are going to be irrelevant because now Henry Ford is coming up with it. They don't realize that, so they invest in horseshoes, right? So there are going to be disappointments. But the necessary factor or mechanism or process for there being as much coordination as there can be is this process of competition. We would have almost no coordination of plans or compatibility of plans without the process of discovery. Right? But the process of discovery is not a simple process by which things are brought into some sort of rigid or neat order. There's a lot of sloppiness. There's a lot of incompatibility, a lot of disappointment that's generated by the process of competition itself. In a sense, it's not a nice process. And in a lot of ways, this figures into the ethics aspect, the mirage of social justice and all that. Namely that it's impossible to protect people's expectations of market value, right, without producing a paralysis of the discovery process. And so paradoxically, if we try to guarantee people's expectations about market values and quantities being produced and all of that, right, we would disable the process responsible in the broader picture for the coordination of economic activities. So I think Hayek, there was an evolution in his thought, and a lot of it can be seen by contrasting the 1937 piece with this piece, Competition as Discovery Procedure. Now note, in terms of the advertised topic, all of this involves, and in I think a very unartificial, very natural way, combination of ideas about time, planning, coordination, competition, right? It's all part of the same ball of wax, at least in this Hayekian way of looking at it. So my excuse for wandering off purely talking about time is that it's not really possible to talk purely about time and make any sense of it unless you want to hear my list of all the features of real time, but you don't want to hear that. So time, I think, as Marshall said, is the center of the chief difficulties in economics. I mean, all of it hinges on, all progress in economics, I think, hinges on coming to grips with the importance of changes in knowledge that accompany the passage of real time. Okay, thank you. Sorry about my voice. I think it was something in the food. I came with a perfectly normal voice. Yeah. You want to say your name so we could learn who you are?
Yeah, my name is Wolman.
Okay.
Belgian name.
Yeah.
Often, Hayek's piece, Economics and Knowledge, is often understood as a critic of Mises, and especially of the concept of the ERE. Could you comment on that and contrast it with yours?
Well, you know, okay. First of all, Mises said he liked the article very much. So then you think, well, or did he disagree with Mises or not? Or maybe he misunderstood Mises. But he makes a distinction between the pure logic of choice, all right? And that's this. I think that's pretty much this cell. Pure logic of choice and the learning that has to take place because there isn't a single entity to whom all knowledge is given at the outset of the economic system. I think what he was, one interpretation is that what Hayek was getting at was that Mises, in his emphasis on the praxeology and deducing theorems of economics from the idea of action, purposeful behavior, was really just developing the logic of choice. But if he wanted to explain how it is that there can be compatibility of plans among agents within an economic system, each of whom have separate minds, there's got to be some attention to the process of learning and the communication of knowledge, right? And that is empirical. That has to do with, you know, well, how people learn is not something you can deduce from the notion of action. Now, I think that's correct in the sense that you cannot deduce ideas or useful ideas about learning and communication of knowledge from the simply from the idea of purposeful behavior, simply from the idea of purposeful behavior. The question, of course, is did Mises ever think otherwise? Or was it a misimpression based on perhaps some faulty expression on his part? And that I really don't know. But I think analytically it is correct to say that deductions from the notion of action, the idea of action, as Mises says, produce tautologies, right? And these tautologies don't involve anything about how people learn. So they are separate things. It is a different domain of economics. And some of that difference between Hayek and Mises, if in fact there was a difference, I think still persists today with people who think that they can derive a lot more a priori than in fact they can.
The videos you mentioned are actually available on UFM at hayek.ufm.edu. I just finished editing all 15 and a half hours of them. The best one is actually the one with Robert Bork, if you're interested. Anyway, in the 80s, Hayek emphasized the importance of an evolutionary process, and he gave great deference for the results of an evolutionary process.
Right.
Do you have any comment on that?
Well, that's a big issue. Hayek never spelt out in any detail the evolutionary process that he had in mind, except to say that it involved a group selection. So he didn't work it out in any detail, and it's hard to, in the absence of any detailed working out of the process, it's hard to agree that this process produces results consistent with what he said it produces, namely, in the context of the law, the development of the common law, it's supposed to produce legal rules that in some way embody the experience of prior generations, and therefore should have a presumption of being valuable and conducing to the survival of the system of the market system. But none of that is clearly worked out, and I think it's more suggestive than it is in any way definitive. And I think one of the things that's missing from it is the recognition that the legal process in the early days of the common law, it was a competitive process, that we had different courts literally competing with each other, and that's not the same common law as the 19th century common law or the 20th century common law. And that's why you can get a situation in which you can say, well, what happened? We still have common law, but a lot of times it produces, things which are quite inimical to the maintenance of a market order. What changed? Well, the nature of the production of legal precedents is much less competitive today and is more affected by statutory law than it was in the past. So these are certain considerations that one has to raise in thinking about Hayek's point about the deference that we should give to the common law. I agree more with Menger on this than Hayek. Menger says, yes, there's a lot of value in the common law. He says, but every generation has a responsibility to rationally evaluate the law and to see what it's doing. Now, that's not quite Hayek's position. In fact, it's probably contrary to Hayek's position. But I agree more with the Menger position, certain deference, but you know, don't go too far on that. Feel free to criticize, and you know, there's something to be said about the Menger position over and above the Hayek position. But the basic bottom line is Hayek never specified the mechanism very well, so it's more suggestive than it is anything else. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Stefan. I'd like to ask you, Rizzo, if you would comment in the context of time, ignorance, and uncertainty of financial economics and their models like DCF and real options and so on. Do you see any value in that, or is it just pointless busy work?
I blog on macro topics, but I don't speak on them. So I have no comment. It's because I don't know enough.
Going back to, my name's Paul, by the way, going back to the idea of real versus Newtonian time, it seems to me, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, with the individual, like we've been talking about how we look at society and how we look at time changing, people learning, but it seems like with individuals, do they use both Newtonian and real time in making plans? It seems like some plans that people make would be about particular things and they're not calculating change, whereas other types of plans they're building into a certain uncertainty. Does that seem correct, or how would you talk about it?
Well, if you think about a plan just as a mental object, right? You have certain predictions, certain ideas about what will happen. And so the mental picture of a plan is very much Newtonian. It's kind of static in a sense. When you implement a plan, when you're living through the plan, right, then the relevant concept of time, I think, is more real time. Because as you live through the implementation of a plan, you see the unpredictable come about. Now, the way they're related is the following. I know now, as the planner, I'm trying to make a plan. I know now that the best plan I can make is not going to be good enough, because things that I can't predict will happen. I know that much, right? Therefore, I think the natural thing is to make plans with a certain degree of flexibility, that embody a certain degree of flexibility, right? So plans, I think good plans allow you to change when something unexpected happens. They don't commit you in such a rigid way that if something unexpected happens, you know, the world falls apart. It'd be a foolish plan to make. There's a related idea I was reading in an article by Vernon Smith having to do with profit maximization. Here, should the firm plan to maximize profit? Well, he contrasts that with survival. In other words, if you plan to maximize profit, there's a good chance, or there's a chance, that in one period you will fall so far below positive profits, right, that the firm will go out of business. So better maybe not to literally maximize profits, but now I'm using my own word, in some sense to satisfy or to modify the maximization to allow that you're unlikely to fall below survival at any point, right? So that over the long run, you're not maximizing, but at least you're in the game. Something like that, right? You know that something unexpected is going to happen. You don't know when, you don't know under what conditions, but you don't want to be left in a situation where your plan knocks you completely out, right? So you may plan ahead of time not to do the optimal thing, because the optimal thing really doesn't produce your survival over the long run. Flexibility is another example. Firms can try to predict what output will be at different points in time, but their predictions aren't going to be exactly correct. So you may want to have a plant size or a plant composition or structure that is flexible, that allows you to increase or decrease output in such a way that you can do either of those things without incurring very high costs, even though you don't have the optimal size of the plant or optimal nature of the plant for any particular output. This is fairly standard in a way, but I think if you think about it from the point of view of uncertainty about the future, you'll see that it really does affect the nature of plans. And so the real-time aspect interacts with the Newtonian or planning time aspect. Yeah.
You mentioned previously that I get this idea that tendency toward equilibrium is necessary to equilibrium. The question would be, did he elaborate on this statement and yes, how? Or if he did not, what do you think he really meant by that? Because after all, this is not self-evident. You can certainly say a lot about economics without such a claim. Right?
Well, I think what he wanted to talk about was that a tendency toward equilibrium is necessary in order to give some direction to what happens outside of equilibrium. In other words, we can't take for granted that plans will always be compatible, right? That's a critical aspect of his analysis. That what's wrong with the standard analysis at the time was that it simply took the existence of certain data, right, and made it into purely a computational issue, what the implied equilibrium was, and that which was given to whom, to no one really in particular, but was just out there, would somehow automatically produce equilibrium. Now that couldn't be right, he said, because in fact it's not given, it's given to no one in particular. People have bits of it. So what's going to ensure an equilibrium? Well, there are processes that occur outside of equilibrium as a response to the disappointments of disequilibrium. But where do these processes lead us? So his idea was that without the notion of a tendency toward equilibrium, we would have no way of thinking about where the processes lead us. And so basically we would have a kind of, anything goes method of analysis, where we really wouldn't know what happens outside of equilibrium. And he thought that if we didn't in some way know what happens outside of equilibrium, economics as we have come to understand it couldn't exist. Yeah.
Actually, to add to that question, because I'm trying to imagine that also from a few different products I'm running in my head, and I mean, in some ways, if you look at it from the law of supply and demand, yeah, you can imagine that prices will want to come to equilibrium, especially if we had the oil spill, so there was some, I think it was clams or shrimp or some sort of like seafood products that went up in price, and now slowly the price is coming down to its original setting. But at the same time, when you have demands changing so constantly, at the same time when you have the world changing so constantly, it's so dynamic that it's hard to imagine prices always trying to reach an equilibrium. They might reach for that split second, but also at that split second you have hundreds of people making decisions on whether to buy this or whether to buy that. So that price would, I mean, where does it go? And at the same time, now if you look at a product like the iPhone, every time a new iPhone comes up, unless it's going to be high inflation, or the Apple company changes its marketing, they always bring it out at $200 for upgrade. So I mean, it always seems that that price is at equilibrium. So for some products it seems to work, for some it doesn't, and maybe you could add in a little bit to that.
Okay. Any other, our time is running out, so are there any other questions? We end at 9? Who's the keeper here?
Yeah, we ended 9.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.